Hi, welcome to Church for Skeptics. Today we want to talk about something that's been very interesting to me in my study. We want to talk about the history and origin of religion. I want to tell you what I hope to show out of this program. But first let me say that religion generally in Christianese is not a really great term. As far as I know, there's only one place in the Bible, in Scripture, where the term religion is used in a positive light. And that, I believe, is in the book of James, where it says pure and undefiled religion is to visit the widows and the orphans in their affliction. In other words, take care of helpless people. And that's considered to be pure religion. And we like to say, and I know it's become trite in a lot of circles, to say that we're not a religion, we're a relationship. And I know it's trite, but it's true, I believe, as well. Religion is more focused on what we can do for God, and of course that is dwarfed by what God has done for us. But in today's program, we want to talk about cultural religion. We want to talk about the aspect of religion itself from a cultural standpoint and look at the three prevailing theories of where religion comes from, and that's very important. Remember, this program is designed to encourage faith, but not blind faith. It's designed to encourage faith in Jesus Christ, ultimately. And as a step in that direction, sort of going to first base, we need to look at the idea of religion itself. Does religion just come from us? Do we make it up? And if so, why? What is there about us that has caused us to make up religion? Is it part, as the second theory we'll see, is it part of just our evolutionary process as humans evolve? Does religion evolve with us? And we'll see that that's the prevailing view today. There's a third view that I think is the biblical view, but it's more than that. It is an anthropological, I hope I said that right. That's a big word. The anthropological view that ties in with that is called original monotheism. And this is the idea that religion starts with God, that God actually did reveal and has revealed Himself to us as a human race, we'll say. And so we've responded to that. And the history of religion looks quite different when you look at it from that point of view, but I think that's where the evidence points. And so I think this will be very interesting to you, just if you're interested in history and culture and so forth. But I think there's also a very convincing aspect to this, and I hope that's what comes across. When we talk about religions, what do we mean? First of all, I think that would be a good starting point. Winfred Corduan is just a name I want to give you in case you want to do your own research on this. As a guy I've been very impressed with. He says that religion is a system of beliefs and practices that give us values and coherence for life in a way that connects us with the transcendent. Now, what does that mean? Well, transcendent means other than us, you might say, in a different, if you want to use a science fiction word, dimension. You see that a lot lately. My summation of that is that it's just how we view the supernatural, how we view the spiritual world. So there is an assumption there, and you'll see this tie in later, there is an assumption that there is a spiritual and metaphysical world. Well, I think there's tremendous evidence for that. And of course, the opposite view is kind of like this. You either have naturalism, and I promise I won't get into that too deeply. We've exhausted that in previous programs. But your worldview is either that there's nothing else than the physical universe, or there is. And I think the evidence is just tremendous that there is, just from the universe itself being here. Why does something exist instead of nothing? So what your view is regarding your relationship to that spiritual world is religion. Now, you might want to say that humanism and some natural views answer the same questions that religion does. So some people would call evolution, for example, a religion. I won't get into that either. But we want to look at three theories, three ideas about where religion comes from, and I think that's very telling for our purposes today. The first one is what I'll call the subjective view. And the big idea behind it, the thing that I want you to take away from that, is that religion comes from within us. Sigmund Freud certainly is not the only person who personifies this view, but he probably is maybe the most complete. Sigmund Freud believed, in a nutshell, that all religion is just wish fulfillment. And he says that from two standpoints. The first being that we have fathers who are not perfect, and so we project a perfect father into the cosmic realm, and that's wish fulfillment. We project this image of God as to what we think our fathers, or who we think our fathers should be. My problem with that is that he doesn't cover all religion, certainly, by doing that. It's almost like he's dealing with the monotheistic religion of his day. His second, which might be a little more discussable, is that it's a feeling of helplessness that we have. That part of the human psyche is, because we have an awareness of our smallness, we have a feeling of helplessness, and I think that's certainly true. So he suggests that all religion is wish fulfillment. In other words, I'm not in control. There's so many things out of my control. I wish someone was in control to whom I could turn. I wish that someone could do the things that I can't do, and the list of what I can do is much shorter than the list of what I cannot do. So it's my wish fulfillment. Now, the reason I'm going to go ahead and critique that view very simply and shortly so we can move on to the prevailing view. The problem with this subjective Freudian view is that it says nothing about the truth of religion. All of what he says could be true. I definitely do feel helpless sometimes. My father died when I was 5 years old, and so I could definitely want to project that image. But that says nothing about whether my faith is true or not. It says nothing about whether the validity of my faith is there or not. And atheism itself could be the greatest example of wish fulfillment. Suppose we know intrinsically, as the Bible would teach, that there's a God. The theologians call that the sensus divinitatis, and we wish there weren't. And we want to get out from under that authority over us, the moral authority that God has over us. Well, atheism is the greatest example of wish fulfillment that would exist then. So even though that view is interesting and there's maybe an element of truth in it, it certainly has nothing to say about the validity of religion itself. Well, that pretty much takes care of the subjective view, I think. The second view, and we'll take a little longer with this one because it's the prevailing view, and you'll see of necessity it is, and that's the evolutionary view of the origin of religion. It's necessarily the prevailing view because evolution itself, Darwinian evolution in particular, is the prevailing view in our culture at least. So that means that everything has to be explained in terms of the evolution of life itself, and in particular in this case, of man itself. So as I said, the prevailing view is the evolutionary view because everything has to be explained in evolutionary terms. And what that means also is it's explainable in genetic terms. So correlate these two. Primitive, what they call primitive man then, is expected to be less developed, less evolved. So obviously his technology is less evolved, and so is his religion. So it would be more simplistic. So you would have a predictable set pattern then of the progress, the evolution of religions. And that's what the evolutionary model does. It predicts those things. The first stage, they say, which primitive man should have, is basically magic. As humanity evolved, they would say, and became aware of his own smallness, he begins to imagine or develop the concept of a spiritual reality. And so there's nothing personal about this reality. You might call it the Force, which, I presume Star Wars is kind of along that realm, using the same terminology at least. And along with that comes the desire to manipulate those forces for a desired result. Now what that's called, there are two words that would describe that first low level, so to speak, stage: magic and fetishism. So that this might be associated with just these forces. They might not even project them into rocks or animals at this stage. And I'm speaking in evolutionary terms here. But just the idea that there are forces out there that we as primitive humans have to contend with, and so we turn to magic, some way to manipulate these forces. And that's the first stage in evolutionary terms of what they believe the most primitive people then should display evidences of that kind of religion. Now, to be sure, that kind of religion exists. We know that. There might be some question as to why it still exists today, and their answer might be that part of humanity has not yet evolved beyond that stage. And they would tie that, of course, to Stone Age technology, or even before Stone Age technology. So that's the first stage of evolutionary view. The next stage that we'll see is called animism. And what's interesting to me is, as you read this, every stage they just promote these spiritual forces a little more. They sort of elevate them a little more. Maybe, if I were an evolutionist and believed this, I would say as the human concept of self grew in proportion, so does their concept of their religion elevate in that sense or evolve. So the second stage is called animism. Now, I originally thought that must mean it's tied to animals, but it's not really. The word anima means soul. And so what happens is in the first stage, these non-personal forces of nature or supernatural are not personal at all. In the second stage, they get promoted. Now they are spirits. And here's the interesting part about this to me. These spirits manifest themselves at this stage of religion in two ways. One, of course, is the nature spirits, where they become the rock god, the rain god, this god and that god, and maybe a spirit that inhabits an animal like a deer. The other cultures, there are a set of cultures who basically, they would say, take this same step, but their projected persons, the personification of these spirits, are in their ancestors. They begin to worship or communicate with their ancestors. Now here's where you can begin to see a major problem with the evolutionary theory. Today, let's say, and I hope I'm not offensive here, it's just the fact, and today, in some of the most advanced technological cultures of the world and highly educated, ancestor worship is still very prevalent. For example, some very well-to-do, well-educated businessmen in these ancestor worship cultures actually use their Visa cards to pay a minimum of $50 to go to a temple to get a priest or a shaman of some type who communicates with these ancestor spirit gods. They pay $50 minimum with their Visa card to communicate, maybe to pray, or to make a request of this, whatever you call him here, the communicator. He takes this $50, and first thing he does is ring a big gong to awaken this spirit god, ancestor god. And then he secondly offers him a great big barrel of wine of some type. And I'm not sure if he has to, I wonder sometimes if the shaman or whoever has to consume it on the god's behalf. But I don't know that. But at any rate, what I'm trying to show is here you've got a problem. You've got an advanced technology, an advanced culture. Certainly they're as evolved as anybody in the world as far as human technology, human intelligence, human accomplishment, and yet they still have this ancestor worship, which is only second on the chain of evolutionary development. So I wonder how that works. So next we'll move on to the third stage, which we associate with a lot of cultures in ancient history. If you'd say ancient history, this is what we think of. The third stage is polytheism. Before I get too far into the polytheistic view, I should say a couple more things about animism that were interesting to me. When these spirits became personified into ancestors or nature spirits, one similarity usually is that they are finite, that is, they're tied to a certain area, and what they desire is respect and information. That is, if you have an ancestor spirit, you want to get permission from them before, let's say, you plow your field or before you marry. You want to get permission from the spirit that presides over that area of your life, whether it's an ancestor or a nature. But as you can see, they're developing more and more into personification. Then we move again to the polytheistic view. When we talk about polytheism, we immediately associate that with ancient cultures: Egypt, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, even in Asia, the idea of many gods. Now, at this stage, we go from ancestor and spirit respect to actually worship. These are superior beings in polytheism. And what's amazing, though, is that at no level, at yet level, they're not really considered good. The total group, if you'll say, of gods of any culture is called its pantheon, but there's not even unity among the gods. The gods often have conflict with each other. They kind of are super people in a sense, or superhuman beings who have their own culture, you might say, among themselves. And that's where we get all this mythology and tied to all these cultures here. So in polytheism, here's where the advancement is. They would say we move from the idea of respect and giving information and getting permission. Now we're into the idea of actually worshiping these gods. And that's where the ritual just goes right along with this. The rituals advance. That's where the position of the priestly class, those people who have special abilities, they become the experts. And in virtually all these cultures, people are glad to turn over the responsibility of actually contacting these superior beings at whatever level, especially the polytheistic level, to the priesthood. And so they have a ruling, usually, capacity. And I think that's why you take Egypt, Babylon, Persia, Rome, all of them were basically theocratic type cultures. In other words, the government was very well tied to the priestly class. If you were going to be a good citizen, for example, of Athens, you also had to be loyal to and give honor to the gods. That was considered part of citizenship because they were so tied together. And again, that's because of a priestly class of people who are tied in and have a great deal of political power. So you have magic or fetishism, animism, polytheism. There's one more step, small step, between there and monotheism, which is considered the highest evolutionary form of religion, and that's called henotheism, which means there may be many gods, but there's only one main God that is worthy of worship, sort of the big God. And there you see that a lot even in the Old Testament and other cultures, and they're always talking about my God can beat up your God. So that comes from this concept of one main God. So then you move into the highest form of evolutionary religion, which is monotheism, which is kind of interesting to me. In the monotheistic forms of religion, there are some common characteristics. The most important one may be, of course, there's one God, only one God, that He is completely outside of His creation. The pantheistic view is that God is all and all is God. It's just all the same oneness. Nature, the world, God are all the same. We're a part of God. But that's not monotheism. Monotheism is that God created everything outside of Himself. He's not His creation. That's important. Also, in every monotheistic worldview and religion, you have a creator God who is also the moral lawgiver. And here's why I think you take a big leap, because I can't find much evidence of the gods being all that particularly good. They may have had some good traits and done good things, but in monotheism you have a morally perfect, all-creating God to deal with. And that brings us into the third and last theory of religion, which I think is the correct one: original monotheism. Well, I feel like we've been through a lot of material today, and I hope it's been interesting to you. I need to critique the evolutionary view. The problem with the evolutionary view is the fact that it actually predicts something that is not observable. It's not observed. Let me say it this way. There's never been an observable culture that has gone from, in its history, from magic or fetishism and advanced through those stages. What we see, as a matter of fact, is actually the opposite of that. And that leads us to the biblical model. And it's not, I say biblical model because that's what I want to support, but it's actually another anthropological, is that right, model? Called original monotheism. And the idea here is the opposite of the others in that in original monotheism, religion starts with God. Now certainly that is a biblical worldview, is that God revealed Himself. Let me give you, I think it would be profitable because I'm afraid we're going to run out of time, just simply the Bible story. And I don't use the word story to implicate in any way that it's not true or that it's a myth. In biblical terms, God creates the universe, creates the world, and His highest creation is mankind. And God revealed Himself to humanity, so it starts with Him, and it all initiates with God, creation in particular. And so man has a relationship with God, and part of the terms of that relationship is that God's God and man's not. We're not. The fall of man is based upon, and however you want to view, I take it pretty literally here with Satan tempting them, but you wouldn't have to do that. If you assume that the heart of the disconnect, if you will, between true religion, the worship of the one true God, and us is our disobedience, that we wanted to take over for ourselves moral responsibility. And so therein lies the problem, what the Bible would call, theologians would call the fall of man and the disconnect that comes with that. And so the history of mankind, in large part, has been two things. Number one, God letting us have our way and facing the consequences. And number two, God continually pursuing us and offering us a renewed relationship with Himself. Now, having said that, here's what the anthropological evidence shows. And this is well documented. Just take your Encyclopedia of World Religions. Virtually every culture, and the more primitive the culture, the stronger the evidence. In virtually every culture, the earliest recorded religion is monotheism, with no magic involved at all. Now, how's that possible? How can that be? How can it be, for example, that the earliest recorded religion in China is the worship of the God whom they referred to as Shanghai? And this is all in the encyclopedia, all you just look it up. One true God, creator. He fits all of the characteristics of the God of Judaism, of the God of Christianity, and virtually the same as the God of Islam, all the monotheistic religions. He's the creator, the moral lawgiver. He's the only God, and there's no magic involved in worshiping Him. The history says that what happened is, as emperors began to worship this magnificent God that was beyond really their comprehension, they thought that the common people in China were not able, not royal enough to worship this great God Shanghai, and so there was actually an emperor who forbade the worship of Shanghai by the common people. And in that case, again, the emperors kind of became the priestly class. We're the experts on God, we'll take over for you. Within just a few centuries then, that spiritual void was filled by three of the main Chinese religions. Confucianism, and Confucius mentions Shanghai, by the way, and just basically says, leave it to the emperors, I'll give you a more humanistic, practical way of life. So you have Confucianism, and then Taoism, which is basically taking the path of least resistance. You don't ever try to change anything, because there were movements to go back to the original worship, and Taoism, no, leave everything the same, just take the path of least resistance. And then Buddhism, was introduced and of course became very prevalent in China and of course still is, despite its atheistic last few generations. Now here's another amazing thing. The fastest growing religion in China now is Christianity. In several cultures, there is evidence of an original monotheism and then a devolution of religion. And that's exactly what the Bible would say, that as man moves away from the worship of the true God, he becomes more ritualistic, he becomes more, there's more magic, there's more manipulation of these spiritual forces. And that's what we actually see in these cultures. And then often in these cultures there's a Reformation type, somebody will come along, some king, as happened with the Incas, and try to return his people to the worship of one true God. I don't have, that's 2 or 3 programs, and maybe we'll make some of those to give you evidence of that. What that points to is the idea that the evolutionary view doesn't work. It's not observable, or it's certainly not been observed, but the concept that God has originated and made himself known to us, he's originated religion, again, not my favorite word, but for our discussion we have to use it, and that as the Bible says, here's what it says, God has not left himself without a witness. And I think we'll find that true in many, many, many cultures, as is attested to by many missionaries who have found a bridge to take them from where they are back to where they used to be, not to some place they'd never been before as a culture. Thanks for watching Church for Skeptics. Church for Skeptics began in January of 2003. As far as I know, it's the only program that focuses on giving reasonable answers for skeptical people regarding the Christian faith that's on a non-religious network. If this program is helping you better understand the claims of Jesus Christ, please consider helping us continue this work by sending a tax-deductible contribution. You can send a check made out to Educare to the following address with Church for Skeptics on the memo line. Thanks very much for your consideration.